Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into another fascinating chapter of modern Indian history today, especially for you, UPSC aspirants out there, and anyone, really, who's fascinated by India's journey.
This is part 2 of our series.
Right, so if you missed our first exploration into the early days of nationalism, definitely go back and give that a listen. You'll find it in the show notes.
Definitely worth checking out. Sets the stage for what we'll be discussing today.
For sure. Today we're focusing on something that completely transformed the landscape of the independence movement, the Indian press.
It's wild how these newspapers evolved, They went from simply reporting the news to actually becoming these powerful tools.
Powerful how?
They shaped public opinion, sparked all sorts of debates, and really fueled that fight for freedom.
Oh, I see what you mean. Like they weren't just observers, they were actively shaping the narrative.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if you're trying to understand how India transitioned from colonial rule to independence, well, understanding the role of the press is essential.
Okay, so let's rewind a bit.
Sure.
What was the backdrop against which all of this was happening?
Well, World War I, it really ignited this political awareness and nationalistic feelings in India. It had a global impact, you see, and it hit home hard in India.
And this is coupled with, what, the socioeconomic realities at the time?
Exactly, created this yearning for change. And newspapers, well, they offered this vital space for people to express their aspirations, their concerns, everything.
So it's like all this pent-up energy was waiting for an outlet, and newspapers became that megaphone.
Perfect analogy. And the
Yeah.
timing, well, it's significant. Right before the war, the British enacted the Defense of India Act in 1915.
Okay, and that did what exactly?
Gave them broad powers. Press censorship, restrictions on gatherings, you name it, control the narrative during a time of global, what do you call it, upheaval.
Trying to clamp down on dissent before it gained momentum?
That's one way to put it.
But hold on, didn't they eventually repeal this act?
Yeah. They did, in 1922. Interesting thing is, this act, while initially for control, it's repealed, what we see is this push and pull between the colonial governance control and the growing demand for freedom of expression in India, played out dramatically in the press.
A constant tug of war.
You could say that.
And on top of that, you have the repeal of other restrictive press acts, right? 1908 and 1910?
Repealed in 1921.
Yep.
And it's worth noting, this repeal, based on recommendations from the press committee, led by Tej Bahadur Sapru,
Remind me who that is again?
prominent lawyer, politician, Indian, of course, signifies a growing recognition, even within the British establishment, for more freedom of expression.
Interesting. So you have this loosening of restrictions on one hand, but then this huge surge in Indian-owned newspapers on the other. Coincidence?
Not at all. This rise, it wasn't just business. It was fueled by this deep desire to control how India and its people were being portrayed.
Taking ownership of the narrative.
Exactly. Indians wanted to challenge colonial viewpoints, present their own perspectives, reclaim their voice,
More than just reporting the news. It's about shaping the narrative itself.
You got it. And one key narrative, of course, nationalism. Newspapers became these platforms, promoting these ideas, pushing for self-rule. Leaders, intellectuals, they had the space to articulate their vision for an independent India, rally public support.
Okay, so we're not talking about neutral reporting. We're talking about newspapers actively shaping the political scene in India.
Absolutely. Newspapers, they'd publish passionate editorials, opinion pieces, even fictional stories, all painting this picture of a free India.
Inspiring stuff.
It was. They created this sense of shared identity, purpose, even amongst a very diverse population.
That's powerful. And all this happening while the world is undergoing these massive changes because of World War I. Did the war, did it factor into how these newspapers operated?
Oh, huge factor. War coverage was major for newspapers back then. They reported on everything. Military strategies, how the war was impacting India. They even highlighted the sacrifices of Indian soldiers in the British Army. And this coverage, believe it or not, kind of fueled nationalistic sentiments even more.
How so?
Well, by reporting on the war, they kind of highlighted the inequalities of colonial rule.
I see.
Like, here are these brave Indian soldiers fighting for a foreign power, right? Yet they're denied basic rights in their own country.
It's not just an abstract idea of freedom anymore. It's about how Indians were treated in the British Empire.
Right. And all of this was brought to life through these newspapers, reaching a wider audience than ever before. And this is where the vernacular press comes in. Absolutely crucial.
Right. We can't talk about the Indian press without talking about those regional language publications. That's something that always stood out to me in the history books.
For good reason. The vernacular press was a game changer. Imagine reading about all these ideas, this fight for freedom, in your own language. It allowed those nationalistic ideas to really spread every corner of Indian society, beyond just the English-speaking elite.
Opening up the conversation to everyone, regardless of what language they spoke or their background.
Exactly, inclusivity. Creating a shared sense of national identity across all those linguistic and cultural divides.
So you have this easing of restrictions, an explosion of newspapers in various languages. It's like the perfect recipe for a revolution of ideas.
It kind of was. And these newspapers, they weren't just reporting. They were shaping public opinion, sparking debates on all these critical issues: nationalism, self-rule, the future of India.
So they weren't just sources of information, they were spaces for intellectual debate.
Precisely. A platform for different voices, perspectives. People could engage with these complex issues, form their own opinions.
Not just shaping public opinion, but shaping how people thought about themselves, their identity as Indians.
Perfect way to put it. And this is where it gets even more interesting, because they weren't just reporting on political movements, they were supporting them, influencing them, particularly the Indian National Congress.
Directly involved in the political struggle for independence.
Oh, yeah. Advocating for the Congress's demands, publicizing their meetings, even helping to mobilize public support. A powerful synergy.
The press amplifying that call for independence.
Exactly.
Were there publications that went beyond just supporting the Congress, like explicitly calling for full independence from British rule?
Oh, absolutely. Key point. While some focused on reforms within the system, others were more radical, openly calling for complete self-rule, gave those nationalist leaders a platform to articulate their vision of an independent India. These publications were often at the forefront, pushing boundaries, challenging the legitimacy of British rule.
So a whole spectrum of viewpoints within the Indian press.
Yes, and that diversity of opinion is key to understanding it all. Not some monolithic entity, but a dynamic ecosystem. Different voices, perspectives, all contributing to this larger conversation about India's future.
And it's that conversation, fueled by the press, that laid the groundwork for India's journey to independence.
Exactly. The post-World War I era saw the Indian press become a force to be reckoned with, shaping public opinion, promoting nationalism, and really setting the stage for this decades-long struggle for freedom.
It's wild to think about. These printed words, these newspapers, they had such a huge impact on a nation's destiny.
It is pretty amazing. Makes you wonder,
Wonder what?
how do we see media influencing political and social movements in the world today, especially considering how it shaped India's path to independence?
That's a big question.
It is.
One that deserves its own deep dive, maybe.
Definitely does.
But for now, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about.
Yeah, I think so too. And we've really only just scratched the surface. So much more happened in the years following World War I, leading up to India's independence. But before we jump into that, we'll take a quick break. Stick around, we'll be back in a flash to dive even deeper into this evolution of the Indian press.
Don't go anywhere. Okay, we're back, ready to go even deeper into the evolution of the Indian press in those years after World War I. I find it fascinating how these newspapers, in the midst of all this global change and this fight for freedom, weren't just reporting events. They were shaping how people thought about what it meant to be Indian.
Yeah, it's true. They were creating this new national identity, a vision of India free from colonial rule.
And they did it all while dealing with all these restrictions and censorship and the threat of getting punished by the British.
It's amazing. We've talked about some of their strategies, like using symbolism and satire. But I'm really curious about the actual content of these newspapers. Like, what were the big themes and debates that were shaping that narrative of nationalism?
Yeah, good question.
Well, one of the most prominent themes was this idea of self-rule. Swaraj, as it's called in Hindi.
I've heard of that.
You see, newspapers would publish articles and editorials that were so passionate about India's right to govern itself. They would critique how the British were exploiting India economically, like how they were draining the wealth and resources from the country.
Right.
And they would write about how Indian culture and traditions were being eroded. They really emphasized the need to revive and preserve them.
So it wasn't just about political freedom then. It was also about economic justice, cultural revival, reclaiming national pride, a lot going on.
Exactly. And these themes really resonated with people from all walks of life. The press did an incredible job of translating these complex ideas into a language that everyone could understand. They made the fight for independence a true national movement.
We talked about the role of women in the press earlier. Did they have a part in these debates?
Oh, absolutely. Women journalists were actively shaping these discussions around nationalism. They added their own voices and perspectives to the conversation.
That's great to hear. What were they writing about specifically?
They wrote about the impact of colonial rule on women's lives. They advocated for education for women and for social reform. And they challenged those patriarchal norms that were often intertwined with traditional Indian culture.
So they were pushing for a more inclusive vision of an independent India, a more progressive one.
That's it. They were basically saying that true freedom wouldn't be achieved without addressing gender inequality and ensuring that women could fully participate in building the nation, which is so important.
Definitely. It reminds me, we talked about the diversity of opinions in the press earlier, those who wanted to work within the system and those who wanted complete independence. Do those different viewpoints lead to any specific debates or disagreements?
You bet they did. One of the biggest debates was about the best way to achieve independence. Some people thought a gradual approach was best, working within the system, slowly gaining more autonomy over time. Others, like we mentioned before, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, they argued for a more radical approach, demanding complete and immediate independence.
Strong opinions on both sides.
For sure. And those debates got pretty heated sometimes. Different factions within the nationalist movement would use the newspapers to advocate for their position and criticize their opponents. It was all out there, in the public eye.
Sounds like a lively time for public discourse. All these ideas being debated and challenged openly.
It was, and that's what makes this period so interesting. The press wasn't just passively observing, it was actively involved in shaping the entire independence movement.
Makes you think about how all of this impacted media in India after independence, doesn't it?
It's a big question. Historians and media scholars are still trying to figure it out, really. On the one hand, you have this strong tradition of investigative journalism that was passed down, this commitment to social justice and holding those in power accountable.
Right, that makes sense. But it sounds like there were challenges too.
Oh, definitely. There were new pressures from being a developing nation, political factions, competing ideologies. The press had to figure out how to balance freedom of expression with the responsibilities of building a new nation. Tricky stuff.
Sounds like it. So the past didn't just disappear. It continued to shape the media, even in independent India, for better or for worse.
That's a good way to put it. The story of the Indian press during this time isn't just some old story. It's a reminder of how powerful ideas can be. And it shows just how important a free and independent media is and how much potential there is in collective action. Inspiring, really.
Totally. And it reminds us that this fight for freedom of expression, the right to disagree, the pursuit of truth, those are all ongoing battles, not just back in colonial India, but today, all over the world. All right, well, before we get too far ahead of ourselves and start talking about the modern world, let's stick with our historical journey for a bit longer. We still have so much to explore in this era.
Lots to unpack.
When we come back, we'll dig into some specific events and key figures that shaped how the Indian press evolved and the role it played in the movement for independence. And we're back, still exploring the world of the Indian press just after World War I. It's wild to think about. These newspapers, in the middle of global turmoil and a fight for freedom, they weren't just telling the news. They were shaping the whole conversation about what it meant to be Indian.
Yeah, they were building a new national identity, you could say, this vision of India, free from colonial rule, and doing it all while dealing with restrictions, censorship, the constant threat of the British coming down on them.
We talk about some of those tactics, like using symbolism and satire, but I'm curious about the content itself. Like, what were the big themes and arguments they were using to shape that nationalist narrative?
Well, a big one was self-rule, or Swaraj, as they called it in Hindi. You'd see articles, editorials, all passionately arguing for India's right to govern itself, and they didn't shy away from critiquing the British, how they were exploiting India's economy, draining its wealth and resources.
All right, it wasn't just about politics.
No, not at all. They wrote about how Indian culture and traditions were being eroded, how important it was to bring them back, to preserve them.
So it was about economic justice, cultural revival, reclaiming that national pride.
Exactly. And all these themes resonated with people from all walks of life. The press was so good at taking those complex ideas and making them accessible to everyone, making the fight for independence a truly national movement.
And we talked about those women journalists. Were they involved in these debates too?
Oh, absolutely. They were right in the thick of it, adding their own voices and experiences to the conversation.
I'm glad to hear that. What kind of things were they focusing on?
They wrote about how colonial rule impacted women's lives. advocated for education for women, social reform, and challenged those patriarchal norms, the ones often tied to traditional Indian culture.
So they were pushing for a more inclusive, progressive vision of an independent India.
Exactly. They were basically saying true freedom can't have it without addressing gender inequality, without women being able to fully participate in building the nation.
That's so important. And it brings up another point, those different viewpoints we talked about earlier, some wanting to work within the system, others demanding full independence. Did that cause any friction, any big disagreements?
Oh, yeah, definitely. One of the biggest debates was about the best way to get to independence. Some thought it was better to take a slow approach, working with the British, gradually gaining more autonomy. But then you had others, like Tilak, remember him?
Of course.
He and others argued for a more radical approach. They wanted complete independence, and they wanted it now.
So you had this whole spectrum of opinions, those willing to negotiate with the British and those who just wanted them gone.
Right. And these debates got pretty heated. You had different groups within the nationalist movement using the newspapers as their platforms, advocating for their side, criticizing their opponents. It was all out there in the public eye.
Sounds like a pretty exciting time for public debate. All these different ideas being tossed around, challenged, defended.
It was, and that's what's so fascinating about this period. The press wasn't just watching from the sidelines. It was playing a huge role in shaping the entire independence movement.
Makes you wonder about the legacy of all of this. How did this vibrant, politically charged press shape the media in India after independence?
That's a great question, and it's one that historians and media scholars are still debating. On one hand, you have this strong tradition of investigative journalism that continued. That commitment to social justice, to holding those in power accountable, that came from this period.
So that's the positive side, but I'm guessing there were some downsides too.
There were challenges, for sure. India was a new nation, facing all sorts of pressures. You had political factions, competing ideologies. The press had to find a way to balance that freedom of expression with the responsibility of building a new nation. Tough balancing act.
Definitely. It's like the past doesn't just vanish, it keeps influencing things, even after big changes.
You got it. This story of the Indian press back then, it's not just some history lesson. It reminds us of the power of ideas, the importance of a free and independent media, and how powerful collective action can be. Pretty inspiring, really.
Totally. And it's a good reminder that those fights for freedom of expression, the right to disagree, the search for truth, they haven't gone away. They're still going on, not just in India, but all over the world.
Well said.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've seen how Indian-owned newspapers rose up, explored that powerful vernacular press, talked about the essential role of women journalists, and dug into those passionate debates that were shaping the national conversation. And we've touched on the lasting impact all of this had on India's media.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating journey looking back at this pivotal time in Indian history.
We hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into the world of the Indian press in the years after World War I.
And if this has sparked your curiosity, keep exploring. There's so much more to discover, so many stories waiting to be told.
Remembering the past helps us understand the present and shape the future. And this story of the Indian press, it teaches us so much about the power of communication, the importance of a free media, and the amazing things that can happen when people work together.
Keep those history books open, stay curious, and never underestimate the power of words.
And if you like this episode, don't forget to subscribe and give us a like. We'll be back soon with more deep dives into the past, the present, and the future.